Imagine feeling a presence watching your every step, even in complete darkness. Imagine discovering that danger lurks not only in the alleys, but also in your own mind. In the next few minutes, you will hear the most disturbing story you have ever heard, and you may not be able to sleep after it. If dark and suspenseful stories are your thing, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like. Get ready, because the story begins now. Greetings, young soul. It was just another morning, one of those in which the routine of the district seems as lukewarm as the coffee we drink. The city was peaceful, with the kind of stillness that foretells something terrible. And then the call came. A robbery at an institute, nothing special, but when we arrived, all hell broke loose. I ran through the narrow streets, blood boiling in my veins, adrenaline accelerating every breath. I saw the flashes of bullets cutting through the air, heard people's screams, the confusion in the midst of chaos. That's when I heard. Teo, my partner, was there, in a dark corner near the side entrance of the institute. I saw the exact moment he was hit, the scene slowing down like a nightmare that wouldn't go away. Blood gushing, his face in pain, his eyes asking for help that could never be given. I swear I tried, but he was lifeless before I could get to him, and right there in that moment, something inside me broke. Teo was more than a partner, he was a brother. I watched his life drain away and I couldn't do anything. The days after the confrontation were like a blur. I stayed in my corner trying to bury my thoughts, trying to convince myself that it was just another day on the job, but there was something wrong, something I couldn't explain. It was at the first crime scene I heard about. I was inside a house investigating a brutal murder, the bodies still fresh, the walls stained with blood. And there in the corner of the room was he, Lucas, standing, looking at me with that empty look, his eyes dead, but with an expression that left me paralyzed. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to make me feel the pain of his loss, as if I were being torn apart from the inside. I blinked, and he disappeared, but the feeling of his presence remained like a shadow. I tried to ignore it. I thought it was just stress, fatigue, but it was only the beginning. In the following days, the visions began to happen more frequently. At every crime scene I heard him. Sometimes he was in a dark corner, other times right in front of me with that blank stare, as if he were watching me, waiting for me. He didn't speak, but his presence suffocated me. Every time I saw him, I felt my stomach churn, my heart race, and a feeling of absolute dread took over me. I tried to seek help. I consulted psychologists, I went to therapy, but nothing helped. They weren't hallucinations, he was there, in the flesh, or rather, in his absence of flesh and blood. With each vision, the line between reality and imagination began to disintegrate. The most disturbing thing wasn't seeing him. It wasn't the pain in his eyes. It was what he did to me. He forced me to relive scenes I didn't want to remember. When we were on the street at some random murder case, I saw flashes of Teo, beaten, bleeding, his face distorted by pain. I heard the shots that hit him. I heard the sound of his labored breathing as if he were still there, fighting to survive. And it was always the same question, the same agony in the air. Why didn't you do more? I was going deaf, I knew it, but that didn't stop the visions. They became more intense, more detailed, as if he were feeding on my suffering. It was like an endless cycle. Every time I saw him, the images came clearer, more painful, until I could no longer distinguish what was real and what was the fruit of my distorted mind. He began to speak to me, not verbally, but in my mind. His words were like screams, like an echo that never ceased. You let me die. You did nothing. I tried to ignore it. I tried to move away to do my job, but with each passing day I became more consumed by the feeling that he was dragging me into his agony. I was reliving his death, his last hours, his pain, with no way to escape. At the last crime scene I saw, he had a suffering smile on his lips, as if he was enjoying my agony, and that was when I realized the truth. something that chilled me to the core. He wasn't just a lost soul, he was a presence that fed on my guilt. He wasn't just haunting me, he was consuming me. I didn't know what was real anymore. I didn't know if I was seeing Teo or if my mind was completely destroyed. I had lost all sense of time, all sense of space. I was alone, lost in a spiral of pain, and the voices in my head wouldn't leave me alone. And it was then that on a silent dawn, while I was reviewing police documents, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, a faint sigh, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me look back. And there he was again, Teo. But something was different. He was closer, more real. I tried to pull away, but he seduced me, and with him came the images, the memories, every scene of violence, every scream, every tear. He was forcing me to relive each and every moment I had failed. I felt like he was pulling me back to the same place he was, that limbo, that abyss of endless pain. I didn't know if it was death that awaited me or something worse, but one thing was certain. I was no longer alone. Teo had returned, and he didn't just want my soul. He wanted to make me feel what he had felt, and I knew, in a terrible and inescapable way, that this pain would never end. I knew that reality was distorting itself, or perhaps it had never been real. With each new day, the visions became more intense, more cruel, as if Teo was forcing me to relive everything he had experienced in that last moment, in that dawn of horror that marked us forever. But the most disturbing thing of all was the silence. A deadly silence that wouldn't go away, like a shadow that stretched wider and wider, taking up every inch of my mind. The sound of my breathing became increasingly labored, and I realized that the world around me seemed to be falling apart, as if I were being swallowed by something I couldn't see, something much bigger, darker than I could comprehend. It was one stormy morning that something really happened. I was home alone, sitting in my armchair, trying to distract myself with some old newspaper. But my eyes couldn't stop looking at the window, where the street lamp swayed in the wind. Something was about to happen, something that I knew would change everything. I don't know how, but somehow Teo had infiltrated my apartment. I felt his presence before I saw him, like a pressure in the air, as if he were lurking in the shadows. I was paralyzed, my body trembling with fear, but something inside me didn't want to believe it. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to believe that his death wasn't following me, that he wasn't there. When I finally looked to the corner of the room, the sight was even more terrifying than I could have imagined. Teo no longer looked like a human being, he was deformed. His body that was once human was now twisted as if it had been stretched and contorted by some supernatural force. His eyes were now empty, like black holes consuming any trace of light that reached them. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The pain that emanated from his presence was so palpable that it suffocated the air around me. I was trapped there, not physically, but in the mental prison he had created for me. What he wanted, I didn't know, but I felt that the answer was in those invisible scars that now spread inside me. The pain he caused me was no longer just psychological. It was physical. My body was starting to corrode from the inside, as if something was sucking the life energy out of me. I knew what he wanted. He wanted me to lose myself, just as he had lost himself. He wanted me to be consumed by guilt, by pain, until I was no longer able to distinguish who I was, and in a sense, he had already succeeded. I was starting to see things that didn't make sense. With each dawn, more figures appeared, people I didn't know, with faces distorted by suffering, with eyes that seemed to watch me, study me, as if they wanted to destroy me. They were shadows, but more than that. They were memories. Memories of the lives I had destroyed, of the lives I had failed to protect. And then, in a moment of absolute despair, something happened. Teo, or what was left of him, came to me, stopping in front of my chair. His presence enveloped me, swallowed me. I felt his cold touch, cutting like ice, and I knew I was losing my sanity. He didn't speak, but his eyes, those eyes, told me everything. He was dragging me deeper, deeper into the darkness. At that moment, a new memory formed, a memory that wasn't mine. I saw the corpses of people I had never seen, of victims I didn't remember meeting. But the feeling was clear. They had been his victims, he, the real monster. The silence was no longer comforting, it was the suffocating omen. Every wall of my house was covered in shadows, and every shadow was alive, moving, writhing as if it wanted to swallow me. That's when I heard the screams. They weren't coming from outside, they weren't screams from somewhere else. They were coming from inside my mind, distorted in agony. They were the screams of the victims. They were Teo's screams, from the very hell he had dragged me into. I was trapped, immersed in those shadows, and I knew there was no escape. I no longer knew who I was. I no longer knew what was real. And it was then, in that moment, that I understood the truth. Teo wasn't haunting me because he wanted revenge. He wasn't there just to make me suffer. He was dragging me into his prison, into the same abyss he was trapped in. He wanted me to feel the pain he felt. He wanted me to see what he saw. He wanted me to be him. It was my friend Carlos who told me this story. I always knew he was a man marked by his profession. Working as a police officer in a remote city has its costs, and Carlos paid for it with his own spirit. He was always strict and correct. But that early morning changed everything. He told me he was on a routine operation, approaching a suspect in a forgotten neighborhood where violence and fear were palpable. They knew the criminal was dangerous, but they never imagined to what extent. He was unstoppable in his fury. The man, with eyes that seemed consumed by uncontrollable rage, did not hesitate to draw his gun. The exchange of gunfire was quick, fierce, and when the sound of the shots died away, the criminal was dead, or at least that was what Carlos believed. But the scene he described was as if he had killed something more than just a man. The criminal's empty gaze, the blood spreading across the floor like a grotesque painting, and that suffocating feeling that he was no longer in control of his own life. The worst thing, however, was the voice he heard later, a voice that came from no one. "You did what you had to do, Carlos, but you could have done it differently." That same morning, when Carlos returned home, he felt strange, his body exhausted, his eyes heavy, and a growing sense of discomfort as if he were being watched. He tried to lie down to rest, but the weight of his own mind prevented him from closing his eyes. That was when the memories began to invade his head, like a film that repeated itself in his mind without pause, without escape. He saw the criminal fallen, his eyes wide open, the blood running through the streets like a river of anguish. But more than that, he felt what the criminal felt, an anguish he had never experienced. He could hear the silent screams of the victim, the unspoken words, the apologies that could not be said. With each passing morning, Carlos was consumed by this feeling. He tried to block out the images, but they intensified, as if the criminal himself had entered his mind, taken over his body, shaped his thoughts. He could no longer tell the difference between what was real and what was an illusion. When he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw the image of a man, but that of a lost creature, a distorted reflection of what he had once been. His eyes were tired, his skin pale, and the cries of his own remorse echoed in his mind as if they were real sounds. The obsession grew. Carlos no longer knew what world he lived in. During the day, he dragged himself to work like an automaton, but at dawn, the walls of his home began to close in, the shadows came to life, moved, whispering in his ear, and what had once been echoes of his mind now became real voices, the same words. "You could have done it differently." One dawn, he woke up in a dark room, and what he saw, or rather what he felt, made him lose his mind. He was tied up, his hands and feet tied to a chair. But it wasn't the physical pain that bothered him, it was the weight of guilt. the unbearable memory of what he had done. And then the criminal was there, standing in front of him, but it wasn't the man he had killed. It was something else, something distorted, with decaying skin, empty eyes. "Do you remember me, Carlos?" The voice came in whispers, with a sweet tone, almost affectionate, but loaded with a malice that he couldn't ignore. Carlos tried to scream, but his throat was dry, his voice wouldn't come. He was trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't escape, and the figure in front of him began to approach, its claw-like hands touching his skin with an abysmal coldness. "You killed me, Carlos, and now you will be my prison." Carlos tried to struggle, but his muscles wouldn't obey. The figure before him seemed to dissolve and reconstruct itself at the same time, as if it were made of solid shadows, an aberration that should not exist. The face of the dead criminal was disfigured with every second, the empty eyes taking on shapes that were not human. They were dark abysses, vortices that pulled everything around them. And then Carlos felt something inside him unraveling. It was not just fear. It was not just guilt. It was himself. The creature touched his face, and in the same instant, his memories began to escape. Small glimpses of his life were forcibly ripped away, sucked into that black void. He saw his childhood dissolve. The face of the mother he barely remembered no longer made sense. The first day on the police force evaporated. The first love vanished like smoke. Carlos was being erased. "You will be my prison," the creature repeated, its voice echoing inside his head. "And I will be you." Carlos opened his mouth to scream, but in the next instant, he was no longer Carlos. He was a shadow. He was emptiness. He was the weight of remorse that haunts the living. When he opened his eyes, he saw himself still tied to the chair, but something was wrong. He was on the other side. The creature, or rather what had once been Carlos, blinked slowly, testing his body, touching his own face as if trying on new skin, and then smiled. "Now you understand, don't you?" said Carlos, or at least what seemed to be him. "You could have done it differently." The last thing that haunted the lost essence of the real Carlos, heard before being sucked into nothingness, was the sound of the macabre laughter of the one who now used his body. And when the new Carlos left that residence, breathing in the freshness of the dawn, he knew exactly what to do. He would return to work. He would continue to be a police officer, but this time he would do everything differently, and God have mercy on whoever crossed his path. Carlos, or whatever was now wearing his body, left the house feeling the cold dawn wind touching his skin. The water was high, and the city asleep, barely suspected the horror that had just been unleashed. He walked through the streets as if nothing had happened, smiled at passers-by, waved to a fellow officer who was driving by in a police car. He was Carlos, at least that was what the world believed. But inside him, deep inside that stolen body, something screamed. The shadow of who Carlos had once been was trapped, suffocated inside the flesh he had once called his own. He couldn't control anything, his arms, his legs, his voice. He was a spectator in his own body, condemned to watch the monster that now wore his face act freely. And then, the murders began. First, a suspect, a random criminal caught red-handed. The fake Carlos took him to a dark alley and, without hesitation, broke his neck as if it were a dry twig. When the body fell to the ground, he knelt over the victim and opened his eyes in an unnatural way, as if he were carrying his soul. Later, a fellow police officer, one of Carlos's old friends, began to suspect something. He said that Carlos was different, that his eyes were wrong. Before he could say too much, he was found dead in his own home. The crime scene was an unforgettable nightmare. The body was open, empty, as if something had been ripped out of him. His eyes were nailed to the wall, staring at himself on the floor, written in blood. You could have done it differently. The fake Carlos reveled in each act, while the real Carlos screamed inside the emptiness of his own prison. He saw everything, felt everything, but could do nothing. And then it was his family's turn. His elderly mother, who always prayed for him, his sister, who never stopped seeing him as the naive boy who wanted to change the world, they were all in danger. And Carlos, inside his prison of shadows, fought against the invisible bonds, struggling desperately, trying to regain control of his body. But it was no use. He just watched, heard his mother's screams, felt her hands closing around her neck, saw the despair in his sister's eyes before everything went dark. And then, there was no one left. Carlos, or rather, what was left of him, cried without tears inside the void where he was trapped. The entity had defeated him. His body was now a doormat for what possessed him. But the worst was yet to come, because it wasn't just Carlos. It wasn't just one. There were others. He wasn't the first victim, and he wouldn't be the last. The monster that now wore his skin would go out to find another, and then another, and then another, stealing bodies, leaving behind only empty shells, condemned to watch their own ruin. The fake Carlos grabbed his gun and stared at his reflection in the window. His eyes were black. He smiled, turned to the street and walked calmly to his patrol car. The dawn was still young, and he still had a lot of work to do. That was the last time I saw Carlos, but sometimes I swear I still see someone like him out there. Sometimes he passes me on the street, looks at me with that almost imperceptible smile, and for a moment I wonder, is he still trapped inside? Is he watching everything? Unable to scream, or will I be next? I will never forget that day. The attack was swift, savage, a nightmare that unfolded as fast as a sharp blade cutting through flesh. I was a cop at the time, and I was on those night shifts that brought nothing but monotony. The kind of shift that makes you lose track of time, where the minutes drag by and the only sound to fill the stillness was the creak of the chair or the hum of the fluorescent light overhead. But that morning, everything changed. I was at the security checkpoint at the state prison, a dull gray building in the middle of nowhere. The prison was isolated, an old, abandoned fortress that had been renovated to house the state's most violent criminals. The air there was thick, charged with tension, as if the structure itself was rotting to death from within. The screams were constant, but that morning something was different. Stillness took over, an unnatural, unsettling stillness. Then the hallway door creaked open. I was alone in the surveillance section when he appeared, hair disheveled, eyes empty, as if all that was left on him was a fur coat. I recognized him right away, Samuel Sanchez, the most notorious psychopath in the prison. He was one of the most feared prisoners, a monster that everyone thought had been erased from the world. But there he was, standing in front of me, with that sly smile. I was tense, my hand reaching for the pistol at my waist, but he made a gesture, as if daring me to use the weapon. His gaze was piercing, void of emotion, only the anticipation of the chaos he knew he could cause. "Are you ready to face the truth, officer?" he asked in a soft voice, almost a provocation. Those words haunted me, because at that moment I realized that he knew something that I still didn't understand. He wasn't there by chance. He was there because something was happening in the prison, something I couldn't ignore. The lights started flashing, the camera system crashed, and then the alarm sounded, but not the usual fire or intrusion alarm. It was different. It was a signal. In the corridor behind Sanchez, a shadow was dragging itself at a rhythmic pace, as if it were not human. I didn't know what it was, but it was horrible, something that fed on terror. Sanchez smiled once more, as if he knew what was coming. "It'll be fun, officer," he said with bone-chilling calm. Then, the first scream echoed through the corridors. It didn't take long for the first corpses to appear. Prisoners appeared mutilated, their corpses arranged in grotesque ways, as if they were being manipulated like pieces of a macabre puzzle. It wasn't just murder, it was torture. And I knew deep down that I was in the middle of something bigger than anything I'd ever faced before. Sanchez was disconcertingly calm, as if he was expecting me to be part of a game, and in a suit. That's what he wanted. He wanted to drag me into the nightmare, force me to play by his rules. He had chosen me for this. The security cameras were down, but his presence was undeniable. The shadows moving through the hallway seemed to follow him, as if he were the master, controlling everything around him. There was no longer a boundary between what was real and what wasn't. I was being manipulated, pulled into a spiral of fear and confusion. I began to realize the prison deaths were not random. There was a pattern, but it was not something simple like a crazy killer. It was deeper, more insidious. Something was testing our limits, as if the suffering itself was part of a ritual, a form of judgment, and then I was called in to investigate further. There was no one else. What I would find in the next corridor, in the next cell, around the next corner, I didn't know. I only knew that Sanchez was always one step ahead, watching, waiting, and I was starting to get lost. The dawn seemed to never end. The feeling of being watched intensified with each second. I felt Sanchez's eyes on me, even when he was not by my side. And with each new death, a part of me began to shatter. I could no longer discern what was real and what was psychological torture. But one thing I knew, the game was just beginning. I could no longer distinguish what was real. Every step I took inside the prison, every dark corridor, every distant sound of chains dragging over the cold concrete left me more lost. Time seemed torn apart, stretched like a rope about to snap, and worst of all, I knew that Sanchez was always lurking, like a shadow, watching, controlling everything. He liked seeing me panic. He fed off of it. That morning I was called to investigate one of the most isolated cells, one that should never be opened. There was no reason for it. But the alarm was triggered again, and I knew that this could only mean another death. A prisoner had been found, or rather, what was left of him. The cell was locked, but the door was open when I arrived. The air was stuffy, heavy, as if something had been extracted from there. The smell of blood was in the air, but it was not what I expected. It was something sweeter, more sickening, like a mixture of rotten meat with something metallic inside. The scene was a true nightmare. The prisoner's corpse was hanging upside down, its extremities contorted in an unnatural way, as if it had been dismembered and reassembled. But worst of all was the face. There were no eyes, no mouth, nothing, just a smooth, colorless surface, as if the face itself had been ripped off like a mask that someone had taken off and thrown away. I stood there with my hand over my mouth, trying not to vomit. My head was spinning. What could have done this? Who would do something so monstrous? But the stillness in the cell was broken when I heard a sigh. "You see, officer? That's the price." I didn't need to look to know it was Sanchez. He was there somewhere watching me. I could feel the weight of his presence, as if he was inside my mind, manipulating every thought, every movement. I didn't know what to do anymore. If I ran away, he would catch me. If I stayed, I would be giving in to his game, and somehow, he knew exactly how to make me doubt everything and everyone. The sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor. I looked desperately. There was no one. But when I looked back at the corpse in the cell, it had changed. Now the prisoner's skin was cracked, as if it was rotting before my eyes. The smell became unbearable. The corpse moved almost imperceptibly, as if it was trying to get up. It was impossible. There was no way that could be real. It was not possible that something like that was happening. But it was. And deep down I knew that this was not the worst. The worst was yet to come. Sanchez appeared at the door like a long, distorted shadow. He was calm, as always, with that crooked smile that made my stomach turn. "Are you enjoying the game?" he asked. "Because we're just getting started." Those words, those damned words, echoed in my mind like an incessant scream. I wanted to scream, run, escape from all of that, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. He took a step forward. Without another word, he began walking down the hallway, moving away from me. I knew I couldn't let him go. I couldn't let him win one more time. When I started following him, the corridors seemed to stretch infinitely. The sound of my footsteps echoed, but something was wrong. Every door we passed, every cell we saw was empty, or rather, there was something inside them, something that shouldn't be there. In one of the cells, a prisoner was standing in the corner, but not like the others. He was waiting. His eyes were empty, lifeless, like a human shell. His body seemed to be disintegrating, but still he remained standing, motionless, the expression of pure terror frozen on his face. Sanchez stopped in front of the cell and turned to me with a smile that bordered on maniacal. The game never ends by itself. He just makes you want to believe it does. Suddenly, a scream cut through the stillness. It wasn't human. It was something primal, an expression of deep agony, as if the very soul was being ripped from the body. I will come. For a moment, I thought the prison was collapsing. The ground was shaking, the walls were creaking, and a feeling of impending doom took over everything. Sanchez turned around, and for the first time, I saw something I should never have seen. His eyes. They were empty, like two black holes sucking in everything around them. He smiled grotesquely. "Are you ready for your trial, officer?" he whispered. When I woke up, I was back in that room, but something was different. The air was denser, heavier. Sanchez was there, waiting, but it wasn't him anymore. His face was distorted, contorted, as if it were being shaped by something evil. He took a step forward, and I knew in that instant that the cycle had no end. He would always be there, watching, waiting, manipulating, and the question remained engraved in my mind. Who was being judged after all? Me or him? I could no longer feel my body. Everything was pain and emptiness. I was in solitary confinement. I didn't know for how long. Minutes, hours, days, time no longer existed. I was not hungry. I was not thirsty. There was only that smell of rotting flesh impregnated in the air, mixed with something that I didn't want to know what it was. The only thing that kept me company were the whispers. Whispers that came from the walls, from the floor, from inside my head. I heard my own name being called by voices that I recognized, voices of lifeless colleagues, missing prisoners, even people I didn't even know. They whispered secrets under their breath. Sometimes they screamed inhumanly, and in the middle of them, always the same question. Have you understood the game yet? The answer was close. I felt it, and I didn't want to know. But Sanchez did. He always appeared, always with that damn smile. But now it was worse. Now he moved like something that wasn't human. He didn't walk, he slid. He contorted, as if his body was an empty shell, a skin dressed by something bigger, and he made me watch. Every dawn. The cell was transforming into something different. I saw the corpses of the prisoners writhing, tearing themselves apart from the inside, as if something was slowly consuming them. His face was dissolving into nothingness, like the first one I had encountered, the one without eyes, without a mouth. They looked at me, even without having eyes, they knew, and Sanchez ran. He showed me the keys to the prison, but they weren't recordings. They were memories. They were my own eyes, seeing things I should never have seen. I saw myself patrolling the corridors, but I wasn't alone. Sanchez's shadow was always behind me, fused with my own silhouette. Every step I took was his step. He was always with me. Always. Since the first day I entered that prison. Since the first shift. Since before the attack. I was never the victim. I was the game. The truth hit me like a bullet piercing my skull. I wasn't investigating Sanchez. I was his experiment. After all, who survived the prison massacre? Who was unharmed when it all happened? Who was left alone, trapped there when everyone else disappeared? My breathing became heavy, my body froze. I looked at my own hands. They were dirty, not with dirt, but with dried blood, broken nails, wounds on the palms. My clothes were tattered, the skin full of deep cuts as if I had torn myself open. And then I saw the cell where I was. It wasn't a cell, it was my own mind. The wall in front of me wasn't concrete, it was a mirror, and there, reflected, I saw Sanchez. But he wasn't on the other side. He always was. And then, finally, the game was over. Or maybe it had just begun. It was an ordinary morning when he first told me. One of our partners, a police officer with over 15 years of service, approached me after an exhausting shift. The atmosphere was heavy, the kind of stifling heat that seemed to seep into the bones and sweaty clothes of someone who spent the day running back and forth between patrol cars and endless investigations. But what he had to say was not about another raid, some operation, or a new case. It was something different, something that could not be explained with the simple logic of the police. He was visibly shaken, his eyes glazed, and sweat ran down his face in a way that seemed unnatural. He had lost the shine he always had. This was a man who had seen more deaths than I could count. But that morning he seemed to have been crushed by something much heavier than any arrest or corpse found on any street. "I can't do it anymore," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I see them. They are watching me all the time." At first I thought he was just stressed, a reflection of years of facing the darkest side of society. But he insisted in such a desperate way that I began to understand that what he was saying was not something ordinary. He was being persecuted, not by criminals, but by those he and his team had killed. The ghosts of the victims, the souls he believed were finally at peace, were now back. They always come to me at times when I can't avoid it. I feel a pain as real as that of a gunshot, but there is no wound. They make a point of reminding me, they show me what I did. Those words wouldn't leave my head. He told me that for years, he and his partners eliminated, arrested, confronted criminals and drug dealers, always certain that they were doing the right thing. But something changed. Something began to manifest itself in his loneliest dawns, in his quietest moments, even in his hours of rest. He began to see shadowy figures, always at the edge of his peripheral vision, like shadows that moved with frightening speed, and the pain seemed to come with them, as if the guilt for all the lives he had taken was physically consuming him. That morning, he told me that the last vision was the strongest. I saw one of the guys, that bastard who tortured women in the North Zone. He was in front of me with empty eyes, and he was staring at me in a way that made me feel like he was tearing me apart inside. He took a deep breath, and the pain in his eyes was palpable. He shifted in his chair, breathing heavily. It was as if he were reliving it, as if every word that came out of his mouth was a needle stuck directly into his skin. And when he looked at me, I felt every blow I gave him, every piece of my soul that I lost to do that. He and I almost fell to the floor from so much pain. I wanted to say something that would make him feel like what he was going through was just a figment of his mind, that he was just imagining things, but I couldn't. What he was describing was too real, too visceral. It didn't take long for things to get worse. When my partner tried to move on with his life, the visions began to intensify. During the day at work, he would feel the victims' gazes as if they were inside his head. The pain that had already dragged on into the early hours of the morning now took over his body during work hours. He could no longer distinguish what was real from what was caused by psychological torture. The first victims to speak out were the most cruel, bandits that he and his team had killed during risky operations. Their eyes were the first things he saw, those gazes that seemed to pierce his soul. But the most terrible thing was yet to come. One morning, as he was heading to the district, he told me that he saw something he couldn't explain, something that should never have happened. He was alone in the car, the road empty with the radio off, when he felt a pressure in the air. He stopped the vehicle and looked in the rearview mirror, and that was when he saw her for the first time. It was a woman, or what was left of her. She was lying on the road, but she was not alive. Her appearance was made as if she had been torn apart and reconstructed. Her face was deformed, but still recognizable. She was one of the victims of an old case, a woman he and the team had found in a cave in the middle of the forest, brutally beaten and abandoned. He couldn't move, couldn't look away, as if he were compelled to see what the pain had done to her. Suddenly the figure stood up slowly, unhurriedly, and began walking towards him, arms outstretched. Her empty gaze seemed to want to tear something out of him, something deep, a torture he was not prepared to endure. Pain began to take over his body. His bones seemed to break, as if he were reliving each of the crimes he had committed, each life he had taken. He screamed, but there was no sound, only pain, only the eyes of all those he had destroyed with the weight of his choices. And in that moment, he knew there was no escape. They were coming back to claim what was theirs. The next morning, my partner disappeared. He didn't say a word. He didn't leave a single trace. He just disappeared. Some said he had gone off to solve a case in secret, but I knew that wasn't it. Something had consumed him, had taken him to a place where no one else could reach him. I don't know what happened to him, no one knows. But a week later, I found something that made me certain that he had been consumed by those he had eliminated. A photo. It wasn't just any photo, it was a photo of him. But his face was deformed, his eyes were black as if his soul had been ripped out. He was lying as if he had been abandoned on the same road where he saw the woman. But the most disturbing thing was not his face, it was the look of everyone else around him. Everyone he had eliminated, all looking at him silently, demanding the revenge he so feared. And now, a question lingers in my mind. Will they come for me too? Is the guilt he carried, the pain, something that all of us who do this job must carry? After my partner's disappearance, what was left of my routine fell apart in a spiral of fear, paranoia, and restlessness. I knew that something was watching me, something invisible, but that made my spine shiver every second, as if I were being devoured by an invisible predator. The idea that my ally had been consumed by the souls of the lifeless tormented him in his last dawn. Now this idea takes root in my mind, taking me to the limit of what reason could bear. It all started with small incidents. One morning I woke up and noticed that my childhood photograph, which had always been on the table next to my bed, had fallen to the floor, upside down. The glass was cracked. But that wasn't the strangest part. What really got me nervous was that when I looked closely, I noticed something reflected in the broken surface of the photo, a shadow and an expression that I didn't recognize. It was my face, more distorted, with empty eyes, as if I were being swallowed by an endless darkness. That feeling of being watched had never been so strong. Sometimes I would catch myself looking in the mirror, and the reflection seemed to look back at me, but in a different way, with a subtle smile that wasn't really there. It was as if it was trying to talk to me, trying to call me. But it wasn't the mirror that was the problem. The problem was the images that appeared when I closed my eyes. Those images that I could no longer get out of my mind. The figures of the men I had eliminated during my years of service. Those shadows were everywhere. The pain began to manifest itself physically. At first, it felt like a slight pressure on my chest, a weight that intensified as the nights passed. But over time, the pain became more real, as if an invisible hand was squeezing my heart, crushing it every time I saw one of those faces. The criminals I had taken justice into my own hands. I felt an electric shock, a piercing pain that ran through my entire body. There were nights when I would wake up in the middle of my sleep, sweating, feeling my bones crack as if they were breaking, and when I looked out the window, I would see a silhouette, a shadow standing outside, watching me. I knew what the shadows were. They were the ones who no longer had a voice, but were still there, always watching, always waiting. It was on one of those nights that the real nightmare began. I was home alone, trying to find some peace, some moment of stillness. The clock on the wall read 3:15 in the morning when the noise started, a low sound, like something was being dragged across the floor. And I immediately knew I was not alone. The footsteps were not mine, nor those of anyone who was alive. They were footsteps that echoed in my mind, footsteps of something that should not be there, something I could not see, but felt. I got out of bed without knowing what to do, what to expect. I knew what was coming. I knew that revenge was near. As I left the room, I looked down the empty hallway. The sound was louder now, clearer, as if it were coming from the back of the house. With each step I took towards the sound, the weight on my chest increased. I felt like something was watching me from all sides, a presence so oppressive that it paralyzed me. Finally, I reached the living room, where the noise stopped. But there was no stillness. In the center of the room, what I saw made my body freeze in absolute terror. Moonlight came in through the window, illuminating the scene dramatically. There, in the center of the room, was the corpse of my partner. He was lying on the floor, but he was not the man I knew. His skin was dark, almost burned, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. What made me lose my balance and fall to my knees on the floor was what I saw in his eyes, or what was left of them. They were completely white, as if his soul had been ripped out of him. But the most disturbing thing was what was attached to him. Around his corpse were shadows that reached out like hands grabbing him. They were not like any shadow I had ever seen before. They were solid shapes, a mix of human and distorted forms, as if they were made of flesh and darkness. They moved, writhing like snakes, pulling at the ends of his corpse. It was as if they were dismembering him, as if he were a toy being destroyed by the hands of something other than death. And then, a voice. It wasn't a human voice. It was a voice that came from the depths of the darkness, from the place where lost souls reside. It was guttural, distorted, as if it was being formed by something rotten, something corrupt. "You cannot escape. All your sins belong to us now." I screamed, but I couldn't move my lips. Something was holding me back. The shadows began to close in on me, as if they wanted to consume me in the same way they had done with my ally. I felt the physical pain, as if I was being cut, crushed by an unbearable weight, and in the back of my mind I knew they were taking me just as they had taken everyone else. When the pain reached its peak, something made me open my eyes. I was back in my room, sweat running down my body, and my chest hurt as if it had been squeezed by invisible hands. But what terrified me the most was the sight I saw when I looked in the mirror. My own image was there, but it wasn't mine. My reflection was smiling at me, and in those eyes, I saw the death that awaited me. They were watching me. They had always been there, and now there was no escape.